The inside story of the Starr investigation of the Clintons that ultimately led to the impeachment of a president. Was it contempt of the law by the Clintons or an overzealous prosecutor going after private behavior? We'll look into the Whitewater, Monica Lewinsky scandals, and others with the independent counsel, Ken Starr. Ken Starr served as independent counsel investigating the Clinton administration from 1994 to 1999. He was Solicitor General of the United States under President George H.W. Bush 41. He was appointed a federal court of appeals judge by President Reagan. He was a law clerk to Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. Prior to the Clinton investigation, he was rumored to be a potential Supreme Court justice nominee himself. Also serving as the president of Baylor University from 2010 to 2016 and dean of the Pepperdine School of Law from 2004 to 2010. Ken joins us with his new book, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Welcome, Ken. Honor to have you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you.
So let me ask you, I voted for Clinton at the time, and now we've had this hashtag #MeToo movement, and this behavior looks even worse when you put it into today's setting. Do you think he should have resigned at the time?
I think he would have resigned had the information come out much more quickly than it did. Should he have resigned? Well, I think he was in contempt of the rule of law going back to his Arkansas days. When you go through the book, and I don't think the factual narrative in my memoir is going to be contested, what you'll see is an individual who, and politicians don't always tell the truth, but who was willing to lie under oath, including during the Arkansas phase of the investigation. So what we saw in the Lewinsky phase was simply a continuation of his pattern of contempt for the law. And while that sounds harsh, Jim, he was found in contempt by a federal district judge, Chief Judge Susan Weber Wright, found the president in contempt for his conduct in the civil case that Paula Corbin Jones brought. So just a pattern and practice of utter contempt for the rule of law.
So this sort of dichotomy view that he was nailed for sex versus abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and perjury, you obviously come down on that side. Do you think he was impeached for lying about sex ultimately? He
was impeached for lying to a federal grand jury. Now, the subject matter did have to do with the subject matter was what it was, okay? But you say, well, someone lied about his or her business dealings. What do you expect the person to do? Look, we either have a system of rule of law, and it applies universally, or we say, well, we just have exceptions, so let's repeal the laws against sexual harassment. Let's just say you get a free pass if any questions go to matters of privacy, and that's not rule of law. That's just, what shall I say, creating arbitrary exceptions that will deprive individuals of their rights to seek redress in courts of law.
Let me ask you this. Why are you writing this a quarter of a century later? And do you think, by the way, because it is coinciding with the hashtag #MeToo movement, it'll be looked at differently?
I think so. First of all, the 20 years, I was pretty busy. You were kind enough to describe some of my activities since I left the investigation. So my personal circumstances when I left Baylor were such that I was able to write the book. I wrote a book about my Baylor experience when I left the Supreme Court, a job of arguing cases for the Justice Department of the Supreme Court. I wrote a book about the Supreme Court. So I had the flexibility, but the time was right in light of the fact that the 20th anniversary was coming up. And it's one of those milestones that I think people have paused to look at. So I actually began the project before the Me Too movement got started, but that has just, I think, shined additional light on the behavior and to say, well, in the workplace, what is the responsibility and the accountability factor for a powerful man, consensual relationship, as the First Lady, as Secretary of State Clinton recently emphasized in an interview.
Yeah.
No one has said that this was, what shall I say, an unwanted relationship, but it nonetheless was a power relationship, and we are looking at that differently these days.
And I want to mention Juanita Broaddrick and Paula Jones first. I said I voted for Clinton, but I've interviewed both these women, and they are 100% credible. And David Kendall denied the Broaddrick claims when he was Clinton's lawyer. He also intimidated you. You'll talk about that, I'm sure. But what people don't realize is that Clinton showed up at her place at a nursing home she owned and apologized to her. So that ends up being a lie, too. Paula Jones, I found to have no guile whatsoever in her things. I don't know what you think of both those women and their impacts.
Well, I've never met either Paula Corbin Jones or Juanita Broaddrick, but those who have, and so here you have, so you've got a better basis for assessing credibility. I find them very credible, and I do remember vividly the story breaking about Juanita Broaddrick and Lisa Myers of NBC News, who's since retired, broke that story. And so here's a very important point. It's my understanding that NBC tried to stop the story of their own reporter.
Yes.
Now, would that happen today? I doubt it, regardless of political party. But I think President Clinton, as governor, was essentially given a pass.
Let me ask you this, which is interesting. We've just had this huge sexual harassment challenge emerge out of the Supreme Court hearings for the Judiciary Committee. Brett Kavanaugh was actually part of your team. Talk about him.
Yes, Brett was a young lawyer who I recruited first to my law firm, and then when I was appointed as independent counsel, and he was still serving as a law clerk to Justice Kennedy, I had lunch with him, and over iced tea and Mexican food, I said, Brett, I would really, now Justice Kavanaugh, I really need your help. And so, yes, he came on board. He was a key architect of the report on the death of Vincent Foster Jr., who, by the way, did commit suicide at the place where his body was found. It's a terrible tragedy. And then he was also with me during the Lewinsky phase of the investigation and was just, first of all, a person of complete integrity, honor, treated everyone with respect, extremely popular, likable, a brilliant lawyer. I think the nation has seen that. So I believe Brett Kavanaugh, it's as simple as that. He said it did not happen, and I've never said a word. I will never say a word against Dr. Ford. But listen, I've been involved in the Innocence Project. Innocent people get accused and convicted of crimes that they did not commit. Mm-hmm. So I think we just have an issue here of not just he said, she said, but he has corroborating evidence, including his calendar, and he has witnesses who said, no, this just did not happen. And frankly, there was a failure of corroboration on the other side. So the evidence pointed entirely, as I see it, not entirely, but overwhelmingly in favor of Brett Kavanaugh. And I think it came down just to a question of politics. Who do I want to believe, as opposed to what is the fair and just resolution of this contested set of facts? And I think he wins.
Yeah, I have to say, I personally think that drinking played an issue in this stuff, and that he did a little bit more drinking than he let on. But again, we're not going to be able to determine that. The whole spin that worked against you, that you were an out of control, prosecutor, and that it was a personal moral crusade. I want you to talk about that. But the way you put it as a self-inflicted drama on the nation by Clinton, I think, was really well put. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, that's right. This was all spin. Howard Kurtz, then of the Washington Post, wrote a very fine book called Spin Cycle Inside the Clinton Propaganda Machine. Every White House has a spin machine, but I will tell you this. The Clintons were absolutely skillful and ruthless at attacking anyone who got in their way, and I was viewed as getting in their way, even though I was appointed by a court of law to investigate possible crimes, and that's exactly what I did. And yet the tables were turned, and people like James Carville mocking my faith, which I think the press should have recoiled at. I think the American people should have risen up in righteous indignation and said, the Constitution of the United States forbids any kind of religious test or oath to hold any office, but that's what you're attacking him for. So it was clearly a sort of a character assassination attempt, and unfortunately much of the press went along with it. Now, that having been said, and none of it was pleasant, there were so many truth seekers in the press, and I name several. I would have liked to have had a roll call Hall of Fame because there were so many very fine, honorable reporters, including from the New York Times and the Washington Post, not just the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really out there. And I mentioned Lisa Myers of NBC News. I could mention a CNN reporter and so forth. So there were a lot of people trying to report the facts, but the spin machine out of the Clinton propaganda White House was just a bit overwhelming. But we were able to do our job. Even under the attacks that we came under in Arkansas, we nonetheless were able to secure 14 criminal convictions, including the felony trial of a very popular governor who succeeded Bill Clinton, Jim Guy Tucker, and then we convicted, of course, the jury convicted the president's business partners and Hillary's business partners, James and Susan McDougal, and of course they were Hillary's clients for the Rose Law Firm.
We'll talk a little bit more about that, but let me ask you this: you were hired on to look into this Whitewater deal, this failed land deal. It kind of fizzled out, and I hadn't realized until I read the book that it wasn't even in your final report, that big 445-page deal you sent in there. It became a case about the perjury and obstruction, Lewinsky, Jones, etc. Do you feel there's this kind of sort of mission creep that comes out of these OIC projects?
Well, they can, but there's just a natural evolution. Here's what happened, as I describe in the book. We were bringing the investigation largely to a conclusion. We had one trial remaining when the Lewinsky information comes to us. So the information comes to us from Linda Trope. We assess that information, and what we did, and this is one of the things I think the book clarifies, we go to the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, appointed by Bill Clinton. We share that information with her. She has then expert career prosecutor advisors, and she determined very promptly, this has to be investigated. Monica Lewinsky has filed a false affidavit. She has perjured herself. And why is she doing that? To protect the President of the United States, who the information is about to do the same thing, that is, to perjure himself. So I don't think the American people ever understood that Janet Reno then says, yes, it's got to be investigated. Let's go to the three judges of the special division who appointed me. Let's give this assignment to Starr. Starr's got to investigate. Now, I do in the book fault Janet Reno. She's deceased, so she's not here to.
Yeah, she ended up going after. Yeah, she ended up going after you.
Yeah, she ended up going after us. But at the beginning, she was not only present at the creation, she was the creator of the Lewinsky investigation.
All right, let me ask you this: the 445-page referral to Congress. Why was that not sent with redactions in it? I happened to be flying the next day, so I read it in the paper, the entire thing, and there's a lot of salacious stuff in there.
Well, we filed the evidence with the fact finder and the fact evaluator. We couldn't redact that. It was up to the House of Representatives to do the redaction.
And you expected that? Did you expect that they would?
Yes, they redact all the time. We see it virtually every day with all of the material coming out of the House Intelligence Committee or the Senate Intelligence Committee, and that's the way Washington, D.C. operates. That's the way the two branches operate. So to me, especially my transmittal letter, made it very clear to the House of Representatives there's very sensitive material in there. But as we know, the House of Representatives voted. Yeah. There were some no votes just to go ahead and release it without even reviewing the material.
Yeah, so, cowardly, if you ask me. Did you feel bad when it got out like that?
Of course.
Yeah.
We were stunned. We were all stunned. People said, well, you should have expected it. That's nonsense. I am an executive branch official at the time. I'm carrying on the kinds of duties that I did for 2 tours of duty at the Justice Department. I know the way that Congress operates, and this was an exception to the rule.
The Vince Foster suicide, Fort Marcy Park. I used to drive on the GW Parkway every week when I was working in Washington. I once stopped by to look at it. It seemed to me very straightforward. They found the gun there. He was depressed. Right. He found it. Why did it take 2 investigations?
Well, because there were so many conspiracy theories.
But that's what they were. They seemed like nutty conspiracy theories.
But what I wanted to do, and people can criticize this, but what I was determined to do was to pursue every lead, and so that the American people had the assurance, people can say anything and make any kind of theory, that we had run every possible lead down, that we had done the most thorough kind of job and had come to an unassailable conclusion. And so look, people were just raising too many questions. Some of them were very dark, very sinister, etc., including some forensics. Why were carpet fibers found? His body must have been wrapped. I mean, these were. Yeah. You can dismiss them, but a lot of people weren't dismissing them.
To me, the scandal was what was removed from his office after he died.
Thank you. Exactly. And so we did investigate that thoroughly. These were the missing Rose Law Firm billing records that then appeared miraculously in the White House residence in the so-called book room where Hillary was writing her book, It Takes a Village. So the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming that the Rose Law Firm billing records showing that Hillary did in fact perform legal services for a fraud-infected savings and loan were stolen from the Rose Law Firm, where she had been a partner, taken to Washington, D.C., and then eventually find their way with, by the way, Vince Foster's handwriting and notations, including notations that drew the reader's attention, who would have been Hillary. Hey, this looks like a problem. Now, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
This is all in the record. But she was rendering legal services for fraudulent transactions.
Why? So it looks very bad where they found it, et cetera, but why wouldn't she have just destroyed them, in your mind? Why they were found in her, it would look very, almost self-incriminating.
Why didn't Richard Nixon burn the tapes, right? So that's kind of the ultimate act of obstruction of justice.
She is Nixonian. I'm just kidding.
So they could have stayed hidden, but they didn't for whatever reason. I think taking that ultimate act to destroy, it's one thing to hide, it's another thing to destroy, because then it really is cold on the docks obstruction of justice.
All right, I want to look a little bit at this 825 loan, as it's called in the book. That's the Madison Guarantee, $825,000 that caused all this Whitewater mess. Jim McDougal, I mean, that guy, mentally ill, he's manic depressive. The crux of the case was McDougal and David Hale. Were these guys reputable enough?
Not to bring charges against Bill and Hillary, but we felt that Jim McDougal, once he had been convicted and began cooperating, was truthful with us, and he guided us in direction. We found some documents that he guided us to in a vast warehouse. The documents were in a state of disarray, and you can imagine savings and loan, zillions of documents. So, and he was very credible in our many sessions with him, and the sessions were with career prosecutors and very experienced FBI agents. And then David Hale, too. David Hale was not just believed by us. He testified for 6 days in the trial, and he implicated Bill Clinton specifically as pressuring him to be involved in these fraudulent loans. But there was another one, too, and that was Judge Bill Watt. His name's been lost. We entered into an immunity agreement with him. We viewed him as a very tangential person, but he testified at trial, too, and he corroborated David Hale. So you've got those three witnesses, and then you had some documentation, but we did not have enough to charge the president with a crime.
All right, now David Hale was clearly, in my mind, a bad guy doing all kinds of fraudulent stuff with SBA-backed loans, and the issue is $300,000 that went to Susan McDougal that she used on a personal basis. Do you believe that Clinton knew about that?
Yes.
Based on David Hale, or?
No, David Hale, Bill Watt, and Jim McDougal.
Do you believe that Clinton knew that it was being used for fraudulent purposes?
Yes.
You do believe that?
Yes.
Do you believe?
We simply did, and my prosecutors believe it. It's just can you prove it?
Do you believe that? And then I think Clinton has claimed no memory of this too. We're into the final minute of this segment that he went into the office jogging one day and asked McDougal to hire Hillary's law firm.
Exactly, and that was the so-called jogging incident, which he then purported in one of the many memory failures of Bill and Hillary that we didn't believe. It was just non-credible. I just don't recall that. But in the trial, he said, I'm not going to dispute Jim McDougal. So he came pretty close to acknowledging that the event happened. But the whole event was about, I want you, Jim McDougal, to send Madison Guarantee's legal business to Hillary because she needs clients.
Coming next, we'll look into Paula Jones' prom night Webb Hubble as well. Stay with us. We're back with Ken Starr. The book is Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Susan McDougal now. She never talked. Was she looking for a pardon? Did she have a relationship with Clinton? What was her deal?
Yes, Jim McDougal was a great source of material. He did believe that she was having an affair with Bill Clinton, and Susan, after being convicted, along with her husband, her former husband, Jim, said, I'm not going to cooperate because they're just going after the Clintons. They want me to lie. Well, that was a big fat lie itself, and so she was taken before the Chief Judge, Susan Weber Wright, the same judge who held Bill Clinton in contempt, and again, thus the name of the book, the only president in American history to have been found in contempt by a federal judge. So Susan was taken to the judge, and the judge ordered her to cooperate with the grand jury. So this isn't some hidden conference room somewhere, some Guantanamo. She's taken back to the grand jury, and there are 23 Arkansans. Those are her fellow citizens. And while I can't disclose the specifics, I can say this. Typically, grand jurors, and this was typical, ask questions. So she was getting questions from the grand jurors themselves, and yet she continued to refuse. So she goes into criminal contempt, right? I mean, first civil contempt, and then we tried her eventually for criminal contempt. She eventually said, this document that we ended up finding through a miracle or an act of God, a tornado, you've read that part of the book, comes sweeping through, and here's a car that's got Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan documents, and one of the documents is a check signed by Susan McDougal, Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan, and the Ray line says, pay off Clinton, right? And so we said, what is the explanation for this? And then so this is all very consistent, right, with the Clintons were, in fact, receiving funds, directly or indirectly, from Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan. And she sort of made up a story, but we got that story only by bringing criminal contempt proceedings against her to get her story. Well, Jim McDougal, in his book called Arkansas Mischief, that was co-authored with and actually published posthumously, and co-authored by Curtis Wilkie, who's a very respected reporter for the Boston Globe. And what he says is that Bill Clinton told him, Jim McDougal, we'll take care, I'm paraphrasing, we'll take care of Susan. And sure enough, on the very last full day of his service as President of the United States, Bill Clinton, who set a record for granting pardons on that last day, pardoned Susan McDougal.
And do you believe that Susan knew that?
I believe she had.
Do you believe the deal was as overt as you kind of implied?
I believe that there were winks, winks, nods, nods. But I can't prove it. But you asked, do I believe? Yes, I believe Susan knew that she would eventually be taken care of.
Before we get into Paula Jones and prom night, etc., Bruce Lindsay's kind of a very right-hand man of Clinton, kind of a fixer. Do you believe he's involved in a lot of this stuff?
Yes, he was an Arkansas fixer, and in fact, he was an unindicted co-conspirator and testified at one of our trials, the Perry County Bank trial. And what was that all about? What does that have to do with Whitewater? Well, it was part of the investigation that I inherited from Bob Fisk, who had a number of different investigations underway. He was the special counsel appointed by Janet Reno. So I'm just stepping into his shoes when the independent counsel statute is authorized. I'm appointed by the judges to go pick up where Bob Fisk left off. So Bruce Lindsay was involved in taking cash out of the small bank 50 miles outside of Little Rock called the Bank of Perry County, and the two co-owners of the bank were very involved. The president of the bank entered a guilty plea to violating federal law, serious violations of taking cash out, and that was, of course, to finance the Get Out the Vote campaign. So it was the sort of dirty underbelly of politics, and Bruce Lindsay was the bagman. Wow.
Paula Jones now, President Clinton tried to claim that he had, constitutional immunity from lawsuits while he was in office. The independent counsel Fisk before you asked you to write an amicus curiae brief on that subject. Does that put you in a conflict of interest when you got into the job?
No, not at all. Look, that was a constitutional issue. And I never took on the representation. We had one conversation about it, which came to nothing. And I was very public. This isn't something that was going on privately. I was on the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour saying there's no such thing as a constitutional immunity that the president enjoys from suit. So it was out there in the public domain that I had taken that position. But my brief was, of course, to determine whether crimes were committed, as opposed to taking a position. I never filed a brief at all in terms of the president's constitutional immunity. We did have to fight. It was just one of the examples of what I view and describe in the book as Bill Clinton's contempt for the rule of law. He makes up all these doctrines. He hires very good lawyers. He had great lawyers, expensive lawyers, I'm sure, because he still complains about that. And the Williams and Connolly lawyers, who are really terrific, helped contrive these various and sundry defenses, such as my favorite or unfavorite is the protective function privilege to prevent the Secret Service agents from testifying. Utterly preposterous. Never got a single vote from any judge ever. He lost the civil immunity claim in the Supreme Court of the United States 9-0. This was not a 5-4 squeaker. And two of the justices in the majority who rejected the president's claim, I don't have to respond to a lawsuit charging me with sexual harassment because I'm the president. Well, who do you think you are? This is not some third world country with a king. You're not our monarch. You were elected by we the people, and so welcome to the rule of law. But that's just not the way Bill Clinton ever behaved.
Let me ask you this. It's not fair for you to be in a position of having to answer this, but why wouldn't Clinton have settled the Paula Jones case and caused all this stuff to go on?
Exactly. One of the dumbest moves that obviously took the country through a nightmare, right? All he had to do was say, hey, you know what? I did behave in a way that I'm ashamed of. Here's a check. Here's an apology. Close it out. But he had such confidence in his own ability to skate. Yeah. He could communicate. He could talk his way out of it. He could lie his way out of it. So, the mendacity level is so high. Ruth Marcus, still of the Washington Post, wrote an op-ed using the old saw about they would rather go to the trouble of climbing a tree to tell the world a lie than simply stand on the ground and tell the truth.
I was going to go to prom night, but I'm going to jump because of what you just said. The deposition of Clinton. Oral sex is not part of, the definition of sex, the meaning of what is. Monica had sex with Clinton, but Clinton didn't have sex with Monica. Talk a little bit about the depositions, what it was like in the room, et cetera, and these kinds of wordsmith gaming.
Yes, it was 4 hours long, and I was hoping, I'm the eternal optimist, that the president would come clean. But he chose to follow a foolhardy course and to commit perjury, and I was just heartsick. I wanted the investigation to be over. As you may recall, I was trying to get to Pepperdine University to become the dean of the law school and so forth and have a new chapter, a professional chapter. My family was excited about the possibility of living in beautiful Malibu overlooking Santa Monica Bay and put this nonsense behind us. And here he is, he's lying under oath. And so I was disheartened, but I knew that even though I was disheartened and I asked questions, I asked very few questions during that deposition, the principal line of questions had to do with the invocation of executive privilege and why did you authorize people to invoke executive privilege to prevent their testimony when there was no grounds for it whatsoever. And, of course, he answered, and we had his testimony, and that ended up finding its way into count 11 of the referral, which I viewed as the key, sort of the capstone of our referral, which was the abuse of power. And what he was doing as part of his testimony on that very tense day, and then, of course, he'd addressed the American people that night, was simply to carry on what I saw as a pattern of an abuse of power, abuse of presidential power.
Do you believe he suborned perjury with Betty Curry, his secretary?
I think he was moving in that direction, and the idea that he would suggest to her, and by the way, he was violating the judge's explicit ruling. He walks out of the deposition, which is on a Saturday, and then the very next day he brings Betty Curry in. She's a very faith-oriented woman. She had been at church and so forth. So she comes in, very unusual. She didn't work on the Lord's Day. And so she's in there, and he's saying preposterous things, and she was honest with her. We were never alone, right?
Yeah.
You were always with us, right? So he's suggesting to her, here's the way you should answer when you're called upon to testify. So, yes, he was guiding her to lie.
All right. What was Hillary like in her depositions?
In contrast to her spouse, Bill Clinton, who's Mr. Charm, and it's one of the reasons he survived, because of his charm, his charisma, the economy was doing well, we were at peace, and so forth, and thank goodness for both those. Hillary was very icy, was very cold, very aloof, and utterly unbelievable. She had the most colossal memory failure known to humanity, and all of us were just essentially rolling our eyes in disbelief that she could be so peremptory and imperious and just say, no, I don't recall that, not that I recall. And so these very intelligent, Yale-educated lawyers suddenly had not been eating their blueberries or whatever, because they couldn't remember virtually anything about anything unless it tended to exculpate them.
Ken, she was not indictable, though?
And I describe this in some detail in the book. We drew up a draft indictment supported by a very elaborate prosecution memo. In the trade, we call it a pros memo. And we sat around the table and we considered bringing the indictment in Little Rock against her for the crimes we believe that she, Hillary Rodham Clinton, had committed. But we determined, as professionals, we simply did not have sufficient admissible evidence to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, prom night, when Linda Tripp was wired up to sort of trap Monica, did you feel that? I mean, that was appropriate, and did you guys pressure her not to call a lawyer all those hours she was in that hotel room?
Yeah, no, it's totally appropriate. It's simply a tool that we use. And why do you use wiring someone? It's to corroborate. Someone says, hey, I'm being encouraged to commit perjury. Oh, really? Well, how do we know you're not just making that up? Well, she had tape recordings of her own conversations. Mm-hmm. Well, that's corroboration. But let's be sure. So, sure enough, Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky had this preordained, pre-scheduled gathering, and so we wired Linda, and sure enough, Monica is essentially saying, and we're hearing it real time, I mean, our FBI agents are hearing it, yes, I want you to lie. I want you to commit perjury. I want you to protect this president. So that's when prom night began. So we then, on the lawyer side, we were accused of not permitting her to call her lawyer. A lie, an absolute lie, and we litigated that. That was the charge that was made by her then counsel, Bill Ginsburg, and we litigated it, and we were exonerated by Chief Judge Norma Holloway Johnson in the District of Columbia. So just one of the many falsities that was bantied about, but that's so seeped into the culture that, the talking heads would say, isn't this terrible? Monica was deprived of a lawyer, as if she were somehow put into solitary confinement. For Pete's sake, she was at the Ritz-Carlton, and she was free to go. The Ritz-Carlton. She watched movies. She was reading the Bible, which was a very good thing to do. I hoped that she would read the part about telling the truth and only the truth. But that long that. But she was determined. She was playing us. She was the cat. We were her mice. She was very clever. And so she kept buying time. She tried to get word to, and I described this, that we knew what she was doing. She goes to a telephone bank in those cell phone days when she was walking around on her own at the mall with the Ritz-Carlton, Pentagon City, and so forth. She calls the White House. She calls Betty Curry's phone, and she yells into the phone, Hoover, Hoover, Hoover. So FBI building, J. Edgar Hoover. So, but she was trying to warn the White House, etc. Her mom finally arrives by train from New York, and in the hallway we heard this. Monica's mom, Marcia Lewis, who had remarried, wanted her to cooperate. You're in harm's way.
Mm-hmm.
Cooperate and get this behind you. They're offering you a complete immunity.
Mm-hmm.
You've done something really wrong. You've committed a felony. Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but her mom is saying cooperate with these duly authorized law enforcement people. And Monica responds, I am not going to bring down this, and then she used the F-bomb word, president.
Wow. All right, I want to go to Webb Hubbell now. I've happened to know him now, having interviewed him several times. So I asked him about your book and interesting stuff about his idiosyncratic twiddling of a wedding ring, which you thought meant he was not forthcoming. But Webb didn't really want to comment other than calling your book a novel. Now, let me ask you this, though, because I have a question on this. You put the squeeze on the guy and everything, and we're very tough on him in prison and everything. His case, though, to me, completely unrelated to any of this. It was embezzlement of law firm funds before he even got to Washington. Nothing to do with these deals. So was it fair to wrap him into this and try to put the hook on him?
Absolutely, because, again, I inherited the Webb Hubbell investigation from Bob Fisk. Bob Fisk was very near bringing charges against Webb. So once again, I was just stepping into the shoes of Robert Fisk, who had been appointed again by Janet Reno as special counsel. And remember, who was Webb Hubbell? He was not some stranger to all this. He was the Rose Law Firm's senior litigation partner, right? And he was very close to Hillary, was very supportive of her. And then he comes to Washington, D.C. as the Associate Attorney General. So just think how clever Bill and Hillary Clinton were. They have a protector over the Justice Department in the number 3 role, and they have Vince Foster as the Deputy White House Counsel. They've got both bases covered. Very clever. So,
do you believe that the consulting money he got was hush money?
I do. What else could it have been? So he got tens of thousands of dollars from different clients for whom he rendered no services. Public relations services. And we could not identify, and Webb was unable to identify, any substantial, meaningful work that he did for any of these clients. And the result was that the Clinton White House, through the Chief of Staff, first Mac McLarty and also Erskine Bowles, I think they're both honorable people. I'm not saying they were involved in a hush money direct intent to hush him up, but what we know is that the Chief of Staff at the White House said to Hillary Rodham Clinton, we will take care of Webb. Now, I think that had, from their perspective, look, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, that had an innocent meaning, that, look, here's a guy who got himself into a bind, et cetera, so we will help take care of him. But the upshot was he wasn't cooperating with us, and we said to his lawyer, John Niels, Webb is not being forthcoming with us. And we also have the prison tape. Well, it looks like, with Webb saying from Cumberland Prison, federal prison, to his wife, Susie, well, it looks like I'll just have to roll over again. Now, what could that possibly mean? In bed? No, right? It just defies credulity that someone could provide no services and from political friends of the White House be paid more money, significantly more money, than he ever made as a lawyer at the Rose Law Firm.
Final national segment, Clinton investigation with independent counsel Ken Starr coming up. And the author of the Starr Report leading to the impeachment of Clinton, Ken Starr himself, talking with us. First question here in our final segment. You were on this for 5 years. You'd come up with 14 convictions, but why so long?
For a variety of reasons. One, we were not getting a whole lot of cooperation from a whole lot of people. Let's just take Jim Guy Tucker as an example. Mm-hmm. He fought his tooth and nail. He was very, very ably represented by counsel, both local counsel, a Chicago trial lawyer, George Collins, just fought his tooth and nail. Then he's convicted in May of 1996. So we hoped that Jim Guy Tucker would then begin cooperating with us with respect to the other aspect of his wrongdoing that Bob Fisk had under investigation, and that was his cable fraud. People said, what does that have to do with Whitewater? Well, Bob Fisk gets this information, and he's going after it. what we know is that a multi-million-dollar fraud was committed by Jim Guy Tucker, his Little Rock lawyer, and his Boston, Massachusetts business partner. Okay, so we're saying, okay, well, George Collins, his great lawyer, comes down from Chicago, comes over to Washington, meets with us and said, I want you to dismiss all charges against Jim Guy, and he will cooperate. What do you mean dismiss all charges? The grand jury has returned an indictment that involves a multi-million-dollar fraud. He'll cooperate if you dismiss all charges. Well, that was no deal. So he continues to resist. We had to keep working that case. We finally got his lawyer to plead guilty, right? Then we got his business partner to plead guilty. And his business partner is a good guy, Bill Marks, and I think that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. When in court, Bill Marks said, when asked, how do you plead? And he said, and I've described this, I am guilty, Your Honor. I mean, I was there in court. It was just an amazing, dramatic moment. It was a catharsis. He was so tired of the fraud. He was so tired of the mendacity. But Jim Guy continued. It was only in February of 1998. So that took another 2 years that Jim Guy finally threw in the towel and said, okay, I'm going to enter a guilty plea. So that's an example. Look at Susan McDougal. Yeah. We were trying to get her evidence. She goes to prison. She said, I'm not going to testify before the grand jury, et cetera. You know that story. So there were many different dimensions of the investigation. Then we were just about to wrap it up in 1997 when then the Monica Lewinsky information came to us in January of 1998. So, yes, it was long, but essentially we had a number of investigations inherited by Bob Fisk, and then we had add-ons. Attorney General Janet Reno said on the FBI files, how did those appear? Why is James Baker, Republican officials, FBI files here in the White House? She assigned that to us. The firing of the travel office personnel, which was an example of Hillary Rodham Clinton's ruthlessness, firing totally innocent people, 7 people ushered out of the White House, taken out as if they were a bunch of crooks. Some of them were eventually rehired, so that what? She could take care of one of her cronies, the Arkansas film guy. So time and time again, we had failures to cooperate, and then we also had a number of add-ons to the wide-ranging investigation.
Now, even you believe that he should not have been impeached or removed from office by the end?
No, I don't say that. I think that the House of Representatives did what the House of Representatives thought was appropriate under the circumstances, especially in light of his lying to the grand jury. I think impeachment would have been avoided if he had come clean and not lied before the federal grand jury, which is kind of the ultimate thing. What I have said is impeachment is meant by the founding generation to be a sanction of absolutely last resort because you're overturning an election. Mm-hmm. And how do we know that? Because of the 2/3 Senate majority requirement. And so what I have said, and it's one of the reasons that this book, I think, has meaning for the present, is that the book is saying be very careful before you start marching down the road of impeachment because you're just going to tear the country further apart.
On the Office of Independent Counsel and these kinds of investigations, which some people say end up becoming fishing expeditions until they find something, you support the abolishment of the concept, and where are you on the Mueller investigation?
I supported the concept of abolishing this special arrangement that Congress created in the independent counsel law and so forth. But no, we need special counsels, and I have confidence in Bob Mueller's integrity, and I have expressed concern about some of the people around him, the rank partisanship and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I'm very hopeful that Bob will control all that and give us his best professional judgment. But we have to have a mechanism to check dishonest people, including the President of the United States.
All right. Do you believe that because of your role in this, you did not make it to the Supreme Court? And as you look back, was it worth it?
Well, I know that I was ruled out from any serious consideration because of the controversy, because you never know who's going to get the nod. I came in second behind David Souter because of the strong support that David Souter had from his fellow New Hampshireite, John Sununu. So what can you do about that, right? I had a lot of support from White House people.
Mm-hmm.
Boyd and Gray, who was counsel to the president, was supportive of my getting the nomination and so forth. So you never know, but I certainly was ruled out from consideration. Was it worth it?
Yeah.
Yes, it was. The country cannot become a third world country. Look at what's happening in countries like Brazil, in Malaysia, in Japan. People are being called to account around the world, and that's who we are. We believe in honest government as the American people. We may shout and scream at one another in terms of policies, whether it's immigration or Obamacare or whatever, but we want our public officials to be honest, and that's what the special counsel device is meant to do. That's what the independent counsel law was meant to achieve. So we're carrying out happily the same function with Bob Mueller that I was charged with under a statute, which had these difficulties, including the final thing I want to say on that is that the independent counsel statute created this engine and dynamic in favor of impeachment. That is gone.
As we get down to the close, tell us you actually did not meet Monica Lewinsky during the actual OIC investigation, but you had a chance encounter with her, rather recently?
Yes, at Christmas Eve. I deliberately did not deal with Monica, the witness. I described an incident where we were assessing her credibility with the wonderful Sam Dash, who was the chief counsel to the Senate Watergate Committee and so forth. And we knew then finally when she fired her terrible lawyer in Los Angeles and hired great lawyers in Washington, D.C., both of whom I knew and respected. They're great people, Jake Stein and Plato Cocheros. Anyway, so yes, I deliberately did not deal with her nor even meet with her. But then Christmas Eve, New York City, we're finishing dinner at a wonderful restaurant in the West Village. I'm trying to get everybody in the family, who had 3 generations, into cabs, into Ubers or whatever, to get over to church for lessons and carols. And I look, could that be? And she turns, and we both, let's just say this, our eyes met. and we knew. So I go over, should I have just turned and walked away? That's just not my style. So I go over to her, and she was quite near. I go over to her, and I ask something inconsequential, how are you? I certainly didn't say, it's so good to see you after all these years. So she describes the encounter as that I was avuncular and creepy. Yeah. I think, that's kind of odd. But you're either one or the other, but you're not a creepy uncle, I guess. And I described it as brief and poignant because she did say, and this is what was really meaningful, that she made some choices that she wished she hadn't made, but that my office made choices that she wishes we hadn't made. Well, I understood that. I just listened to her and obviously didn't agree. It came out that she wanted an apology, and frankly, sometimes apologies are appropriate, and I've apologized any number of times in life. No, I'm so sorry, Monica. I don't need to apologize. I was a law officer, and you were a felon.
Wow, very, very poignant. But I have to say, the book is not only fascinating, but you have built, it just appears to me, a very factually based, objective book, which of course got lost during the whole politics of the moment at the time. I want to thank Ken Starr for giving us a whole hour. The book is Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Thanks to Ken Starr. Thanks to our national audience for listening.